clear. So thank you to all of you who are joining us online and in person here at the Australian National University on the beautiful unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. It's a real privilege to be here, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present for nurturing this beautiful place for generations. We're meeting here tonight and online for the Centre for Environmental History's inaugural Robin and Griffiths Environmental History Lecture, what we hope will be an annual event that honours the enormous contributions of Emeritus Professors Libby Robin and Tom Griffiths to the field of environmental history here in Australia and further afield. Their generosity and collegiality are unrivalled, and we have them to thank for nurturing of the field and our community of scholars. For some quick housekeeping, do feel free to wear a mask if you feel more comfortable. We have some spares down there if you're starting to feel a bit angsty. And we've also left the door open for air circulation, and the bathrooms are just down one of those corridors. So tonight's event caps off a big and exciting year for the Centre, where postdoctoral fellow Dr. Rowan Howard has led the seminar series Environmental Exchanges on the theme of oceans, and where we've partnered with the Research Centre for Deep History to produce a series, Deep Conversations, History, Environment and Science. We've also run the School of History's first year environmental history course for a second time, thanks to Jess Irwin, which we hope is introducing a new generation of students to the field. And last but not least, I'd like to thank a generous friend of the Centre for their incredible donation to support this lecture and our activities. Thank you. You know who you are and you're amazing. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Katie Holmes as the presenter of this inaugural Robin and Griffiths Environmental History Lecture. A generous mentor and friend, Katie is co-director of the Centre for the Study of the Inland at Trobe University, fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and most recently, co-author of Mallee Country, Land, People, History. In 2023, she will hold the Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University. We were delighted when Katie said yes to our invitation to share her work with us tonight, and she will be taking us to Victoria's northwest, to the Hattah-Kulkyne National Park. After her lecture, there will be time for questions and answers before some light refreshments outside. So please welcome Katie for her lecture about the birds and the trees, reading Robin and Griffiths and writing environmental history.
Thanks, Ruth, for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to speak. Such an honour. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands and that this is lived country, as Matt Trinker called it this morning. I thought that was such a lovely expression. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, the owners of the unceded land that I live and work upon, and the people of the Hattah-Kulkyne area that I'll be talking about later today. Including the Lachi-Lachi, Tati-Tati, Wadi-Wadi, Cultivated and Manatanga nations. So we're not solving. Yeah, it's really important. So as you would know, between them, Libby and Tom have received most of the major history and literary prizes in the country. But there's one in particular that sticks in my mind. In 1996, Tom published his third book, Hunters and Collectors, The Antiquarian Imagination in Australia. As fate would have it, my book, Spaces in Her Day, was published at the same time. And Tom and I found our books together on the shortlist for the New South Wales Premiers Awards. So the sit-down dinner event was held at the Sydney Opera House, and such an auspicious location certainly warranted a trip from Melbourne to Sydney for me. But Tom was in London, a long flight away, the kind of trip you only take if you know the outcome at the end will be worth it. So as soon as I saw him, the reception, I knew that he was the winner. Tom, I don't remember all that you said in your speech, but I do remember its now familiar combination of gravity, elegance, and humour, and its impact on me. And where is Tom? Oh, there you go. So I'm particularly honoured to be invited to give this lecture. Libby and Tom are giants in the field of environmental history. their work has had a profound influence in shaping the kinds of questions we ask, the way we think about the history of this continent, the way we understand the trajectory of the historical profession in Australia, and indeed the very way we think about the environment, situating it within the conservation science and the history of ideas. They have also put Australian environmental history on an international stage. So I have come to think of Tom and Libby as the critical yeast of Australian environmental history. The term comes from John Paul Lederich, who uses it to refer to small groups of people in unlikely combinations who are there at the points of significant social change and can turn that change into long-term transformation. Libby and Tom's work has transformed the nascent field of environmental history into a flourishing endeavour. They have done this through their books and articles, through their work with communities and museums, through conference participation, through the much loved and missed interdisciplinary postgraduate workshops held over 20 years, through their supervision of so many graduate students, and also the way they've opened doors and made connections for people. They have spread their yeast in critical places, maximising its transformative potential. As academic activists, they have shown us how to make academia work for the world. In 2019, Libby and Tom were jointly awarded the American Society for Environmental History's Award for Distinguished Career in Public Environmental History, an award that's rarely given to people outside the US. The citation notes that together, Libby and Tom have dedicated a quarter of a century to public environmental history. They have been selfless, never self-promoting. Well, part of the array of the intellectual and creative endeavours to which Tom and Libby have contributed are some 22 books between them and counting. There are 2 missing from this pile, actually, that I couldn't get my hands on. And if at this point you're wondering what you've done with your life, I do hear you. Let's not forget that Libby and Tom have also raised 2 wonderful children, Billy and Kate. But it's on this written work that I focus my comments this evening. Although they've edited and worked on a number of books together, Tom and Libby's work has taken different trajectories. Libby's background as a historian of science and environmental ideas has been critical in helping us understand the way scientists and scientific institutions have shaped our ideas about the environment, place, and conservation. Libby's 1998 book, Defending the Little Desert, used the campaign to save the Little Desert, an area of land on the border of the Victorian Wimmera and Mallee, to trace the rise of ecological consciousness in Australia. As Libby notes, the idea of ecological consciousness means different things in different periods, with antecedents in diverse utilitarian, scientific, aesthetic, and romantic traditions. It's an international phenomenon, one Libby has returned to in various ways and would go on to examine in much closer detail in her co-authored book, The Environment, A History of an Idea. Her interest in ecology has also led her to explore the role of flora and fauna, the mountains and the deserts, as agents in history. What role did these non-human actors play in developing a distinctive national identity, she asks in How the Continent Created a Nation? And how were scientific ideas about nature also cultural? Andrew Gaynor has wondered if it was inevitable that someone with a name like Robin would develop an interest in birds, observing that Libby shares the liveliness of her passerine namesake. As we see in Flight of the Emu, for Libby, birds have been ways of bringing together ideas about science and history, community passion, and nation-making. In How a Continent Created a Nation, she encourages us to think like a banded stilt. The banded stilt's eye view casts light on some of the problems of finding a place for Australia in a global world, she writes. It offers a parable from the Australian interior. Libby's Boom and Bust, Bird Stories for a Dry Country, picks up this idea. This time, it's an emu's eye. Taking an emu's perspective and watching how it adapts to the rhythms of Australia's boom and bust ecology can provide settler Australians with alternative models for building an Australian economy and way of life that works ecologically in this ancient land. Libby's passion and expertise in interdisciplinary work is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the work she has done in ecological or environmental humanities. Libby, with Deborah Bird-Rose and Kate Rigby, was there at the very beginning of this new field, the ecological humanities, they called it in 2001. Libby has been a foundation scholar in the field, contributing research that has fed its growth, able to marry her expertise of science, history, literature, and art, speaking with knowledge and authority to these different audiences. Her role as guest professor and affiliated professor at the Royal Institute of Technology, or KTH, in Stockholm between 2011 to 2017, gave her a wonderful platform for this work. Let me offer just two other examples. Libby's work on the Anthropocene and on museums. Libby's been one of the very few women to venture into Anthropocene studies. As she has said, there's a lot of big men playing there, taking on the big idea and making a name for themselves. Undeterred, Libby entered the fray, demonstrating that historians have a vital contribution to make to our understanding of the Anthropocene. As she says, history adds depth to the present. Our deep past provides a context, alerting us to the changing practices and changing meanings of even the words we use to talk about planetary crises. With Fergus Orlin and Paul Ward, Libby has mapped the key concepts that have become central to the Anthropocene discussion, including, of course, the concept of the environment. It's an idea with a history, and at the same time, an act of imagination, and crucial if we are to understand what it means to be human and how we are to act responsibly in times of planetary crisis. Libby's role as Senior Fellow at the National Museum of Australia's Research Centre from 2007 to 2015 enabled her to explore these concerns more fully. What are the moral and ethical implications of the planetary crisis for how we live our lives? She argues that museums can ground these questions through material objects, and history can help us translate debates about sustainability onto a scale where individuals have moral responsibilities and power. While much of Libby's scholarly attention has been to science and history and impact of environmental ideas, Tom's has been to environment and culture and the historical imagination of Australian writers. In revisiting Hunters and Collectors, I'm struck by the way this early work presages many of the themes to which Tom has returned: historical imagination, public history, memory, collective biography, Aboriginal history, natural history. Tom's more sustained engagement with environmental history came in Forests of Ash, subtitled An Environmental History. It's a book that picked up his earlier work in Secrets of the Forest. The 1939 Black Friday fires are the horrifying climax of Forests of Ash. Tom makes sure that we know how history enables us to understand the conflagration. Black Friday, he writes, collapsed more than 100 years of colonial history into one horrific event. It welded humanity and nature into a unique and bewildering amalgam. It reminded Australians of the enduring power of fire on their continent, and it demanded greater understanding of the past of both people and trees. Not only the shared past, but the deep past, stretching back millions of years. Quoting Royal Commissioner Judge Stretton, Tom concludes, Victorians had not lived long enough. Tom returned to that haunting phrase of Judge Stretton's in his award-winning essay penned in the smoky torment of the 2009 Black Saturday fires. We have still not lived long enough. With his heartfelt lament, Tom became the fire conscience of the nation. He has continued to insist that we remember and understand the devastating power of fire and its ecological and cultural entanglements. And alas, there have been too many opportunities where such insight and wisdom have been needed. With Slicing the Silence, Tom moved from the roaring fires of the ash forest to the icy silence of Antarctica. Always a storyteller, here the need for stories and history and Tom's interest in them brought new insights. Stories were life-saving, history the fundamental fabric of a common humanity. The ice too has a history, and as we know, tells a climate story. The ice cores, suggests Tom, are the sacred scrolls of our age. In The Art of Time Travel, Tom returns to his long-time interest in historical consciousness and the Australian historical imagination. Through a selection of 14 different Australian writers, Tom tells the story of what Mark McKenna calls the most significant shift in historical consciousness in 20th century Australia. The book's narrative arc is a journey from the timeless land to a land deep with time, from Bennelong as a tragic figure to Bennelong the survivor, from imperial history to Indigenous history. That narrative arc is also the story of Tom's own changing historical consciousness. It's a consciousness fueled by a powerful sense of the role of the historian as moral storytellers for our readers and our nation. This moral vision of history animates the work of both Libby and Tom. It's been powerfully expressed by Libby in her arguments about the contributions humanities scholars can make to the field of climate change research, with our particular attention to issues of values and justice. Indeed, the passionate defence and advocacy of the humanities and our public institutions, including local history groups and regional museums, is another thread that links the work of both Libby and Tom. The moral vision, ethical responsibility, and changing consciousness about the history of this country are all evident in Tom's most recent work, an essay from May from Griffith Review. Drawing on the books of Alice Duncan Kemp, whose writings record the stories of the Mythica people of Queensland's Channel Country, Tom has used his historical skills to work with the First Nations group to bring quote, Mythica memories together with ethnographic, historical, and archaeological evidence to identify significant story places. One such place was the site of the Debney Peace, a truce negotiated in 1889 between First Nations people, some local pastoralists, and the leadership of the native mounted police to end the brutal, protracted, and bloody frontier war of the Channel Country. The only written record of this survives in the books of Alice Duncan Kemp. Tom's work brought her evidence, literally carrying the books with him, into conversation with Mythica memories and knowledge of country to commemorate the peace ceremony of 130 years earlier and find its original site. Tom makes very clear in The Art of Time Travel that the changing consciousness he charts, the new narratives of the discipline, emerged not in isolation, but in conversation. The metaphor of conversation comes from Greg Denning. The conversation can be intimate, civilized, everyday, and life-enhancing. In reading both Libby and Tom's work, I'm struck by the presence of that community of scholars, other yeasty individuals, who form part of their conversations. And you were here, I think. The expertise is wide. Anthropologists, ornithologists, environmental scientists, climate scientists, museum curators, ecologists, archaeologists, artists, farmers, First Nations people, and of course, a healthy peppering of historians, including scholars such as Ian McCallum, Grace Carstens, and Heather Goodall, who've also done such important work in and made their important contributions to Australian environmental history. Many of Tom and Libby's collaborators are Australian. Indeed, many are here from the ANU, but many are also international. Conversations traverse time zones, crossing borders and beaches. My introduction to these conversations was initially through Tom and Libby's work, although I'd been moving closer to Tom's orbit for a number of years. I had him to thank for securing the Jean Galbraith archive for the State Library of Victoria when he worked there as a field officer. I worked on the archive for my book on women's garden writing. Jean was one of the many people with whom Tom shared cups of tea, and the State Library's collection is immeasurably richer for his careful soliciting conversations. When I found myself in Mallee country, there they both were, Tom with his 1994 essay on the Mallee route describing the environmental disaster of the widespread clearing of the Mallee tree, and Libby with her book Defending the Little Desert and her bird's eye view on the Mallee farm. The more I worked in environmental history, the sharper the realisation of what many of you will know. that it's impossible to work in this field in Australia and not continually feel that Libby and Tom have been there before you, irrespective of the path you take. This is not just because the breadth of their own work is so great, but also because the challenges they have posed speak to us all. Tom observed in 2007 that Australian history is like a giant experiment in ecological crisis and management, sometimes a horrifying concentration of environmental damage and cultural loss, and sometimes a heartening parable of hope and learning. This presents a significant challenge for Australian historian. Tom again, how to negotiate the rupture of 1788, how to relate geological and human scales, how to get our heads and hearts around a colonial history of 200 years that plays out across a vast Indigenous history in deep time. Our vulnerability to the effects of climate change present us with another challenge, to write histories to, quote, guide and strengthen us. Libby shows us how. Think beyond our disciplinary boundaries, engage people's hearts as well as their heads. Tend to the local, for that is where we will, quote, grow new ways to live in times of accelerating change. It's also at the local level where we can find what Tom calls the magic of history, in the detail, in the complexity, in the conviction that, quote, emotions, dreams, senses, and hopes are forces of history as powerful as law and politics and economics. So let me continue to follow Tom and Libby's lead and time travel to a place, a Mallee place, one with which I'm only just becoming acquainted through collaborative work on a project called Water Cultures with Sue Jackson, Leslie Head, and Ruth Morgan, ably assisted by Margaret Cook, Jess Irwin, and Karen Twigg. And it's Karen in particular I'd like to thank for time travelling with Hattah Lakes to me and covering so much of this history. Karen, it's great to have you here, and Margaret and Jess, all of you here. It's wonderful. I'd also like to acknowledge the ARC and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority for funding this research. So just in case you don't know where Hattah Lake is, or indeed where the Mallee is in Victoria, so we have Australia and then Victoria here, and the Mallee is this region here, that it's an ecological zone that traverses South Australia, Victoria, and into New South Wales. This is a close-up of area, and thank you to Sharon Harrop for these wonderful maps, and a close-up view of Hattah-Kulkyne. I should actually be putting this here, sorry. Sorry, I'm putting it in the wrong place, obviously. Victoria, that's the Mallee. Hattah-Kulkyne in the middle there, and then a closer-up view of Hattah Lakes. And you can see this is Chalker Creek that brings water from the Murray into the lakes. These are all the lakes. There's about 20 permanent and semi-permanent. And then Chalker continues up here. Lake Hattah itself is this one, and Mournpool, which is another large one. These are the two, the last to dry out of the lakes. Lake Mournpool there. Sorry, I hope people online could hear that. So prior to the regulation of the Murray River, the boom and bust cycle of the lake saw them flooding every 2 to 3 years, with major floods less regularly. The Hattah Lakes was declared a national park in 1960, with the adjoining Kulkyne Forest added in 1980 to become the Hattah-Kulkyne National Park. So sort of the initial area that was declared a national park is more this part, and then the area and some bits down here were added later. It's now a popular tourist area for camping, bushwalking, bird watching, and water activities. In 1982, it became a Ramsar site, registering its international importance as a wetland. And in 2009, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority selected it as an icon site for its ecological and cultural significance. This more recent history rests on decades of campaigns to save the birds and their habitat, particularly the river redgums. And it's a very bird-centric story, to use Emily O'Gorman's term. So this evening, I want to explore some of the early 20th century settler history of Hattah Lakes. It's a story about birds, trees, and water, and some passionate white men. It's also a story about the ways place is created through language, imagination, and embodied experience. It's a story that is illuminated by Libby's understanding of birds, ornithologists, and a developing ecological consciousness, and by Tom's insights into the writers and collectors of the early 20th century, their engagement with the deep time of this continent's history, and their creation of a set of meanings about place, its past and its future. Magic happened for some of the men who visited Hattah, and they were keen to share and protect its spellbinding effects. There's several themes that are threaded through this story, and I'll just mention them so you can listen out them. The development of an eco-sensibility, Hattah as a contested landscape, issues of gender and class, town and country, a shift from focusing on individual species to understanding an ecological system, and a parallel change from knowledge as expressed by amateurs to professional scientific thinking. And finally, the role of the state as an agent in this history. First Nation story and European observation suggest that prior to European invasion, the Hattah-Kulkyne area was quite densely populated by Indigenous groups, with villages or campsites every few kilometres along the river. The 1,000 identified archaeological sites in the area also speak to the extensive use of the lakes. The site includes burial grounds, scarred trees, shell middens, hearths, different kinds of artefacts. The lake and the river were rich sources of food and were of cultural and social significance, meeting grounds, initiation sites, birthing places. First Nation signatory Mark Duguay-Grist describes the lakes and the river. You have the river, it's just a big necklace, and all the lakes just hanging off are beautiful little pearls. For decades post-contact, Aboriginal groups continued to live around the lakes, with many integrating into the activities of Kulkyne Station, as servants, station hands, trackers, horsemen. But there were few women there, and different reports suggest widespread sexual abuse of Aboriginal women and girls by white men. Children were removed and sent to Ebenezer or Ramuhak Mission. The Indigenous community of the Kulkyne was slowly destroyed. Nevertheless, 7 First Nations groups now identify a traditional connection with the area. John Birch's wonderful book, Returning the Kulkyne, discusses this pre-contact and colonial history in some detail, and I commend it to you. He also has a much more detailed account of the campaigns to save the area. Although the network of lakes surrounding Hattah was known to some Europeans in the late 19th century, it had mainly been accessed by boat from the Murray. It was a remote area in a remote part of the state, and the Mallee was not known for its accessibility nor its scenic qualities. One early explorer noted of the region, "Woe to the traveller who gets lost in this terrible desolation. He can see no distance, he can climb no hill, and if mallee sticks would bear him on the top, he would see only mallee, mallee, mallee all around him." Mallee, mallee all around and not a drop to drink. Well, in fact, there was water to be found, but it took Europeans a long time to do so, and a longer time to appreciate what they found. So first, the birds. When the Oyen League of Progress met on the evening of the 4th of August in 1914, it's unlikely that the news of Britain's declaration of war on Germany had reached them. Oblivious to this momentous proclamation, the League resolved to ask respectfully of the Director of Fisheries and Game that Lake Hattah and a suitable surrounding area be proclaimed a sanctuary for game. In other words, a bird sanctuary. They wanted to protect birds. The lake was a fine sheet of water, and for those sportsmen who wanted to shoot, there were many other waters not too far away. Indeed, Hattah could be made a fine resort if planted with some more trees. The League's request prompted a flurry of activity and correspondence in the Department of Fisheries and Game. Fred Lewis, the acting chief inspector, was the acting chief inspector, and with his quiet, determined advocacy, he would come to play a major role in the preservation of the lakes. One of his strategies was the careful solicitation of opinion about the value of the lakes as a sanctuary. In 1914, he gathered a few dissenting voices. Police Sergeant Carter from Mildura thought a sanctuary the most humane and sensible proposition I have heard of for years. In fact, a sanctuary is a necessity. He hoped it would interfere with both sportsmen and professional shooters. The latter he considered bird murderers and unworthy of consideration. Acting Inspector Lewis also invited the Field Naturalist Club of Victoria to comment on the proposal for a sanctuary for game. Alex Milligan, a major figure in ornithological circles, thanks again, Libby, travelled from Melbourne with 2 companions and spent 5 days at the lake at the height of the 1914 drought. It was Milligan's first visit, and only 2 of the lakes had water in them. At nightfall, it was impossible to hear oneself speak owing to the cries of the wildfowl. All kinds of duck, swan, teal, plovers, grebes, heron, white egrets, ibis, pelican, stilt, sandpiper, native hens congregate there. On Hattah Lake, which is much smaller than Mournpool, there are at least 2,000 teal in one flock in the daytime. What there would be at night, I would not say. Milligan was captivated by this bird wonderland. He concluded that Lakes Hattah and Mournpool were 2 of the finest, if not the finest resort for wildfowl I know, and you know I have seen many. Milligan and his companions were guided by an Aboriginal man named Johnny. Johnny's knowledge and influence is clear in the long, detailed account of the visit by field naturalist O'Donoghue. O'Donoghue pays close attention to the way Aboriginal people might have used the area, the attachments they would have formed with the place, the necropolis of considerable antiquity, known to be an Aboriginal burial site. O'Donoghue imagines their daily life, men fishing on the lakes in their bark canoes, women and children wading in the shallows for mussels, searching the lignum bushes for eggs of the wildfowl. But now all is changed. Time and environmental change was destroying the evidence of their former presence. O'Donoghue relegates their life on the lakes to the distant past, at the same time as noting the ample evidence of their campfires, a human skeleton exposed by wind, the bone remnants of food, stone axe heads skinning flints and pounding and sharpening stones. This past is not so distant after all. As Tom notes in Hunters and Collectors, the early 20th century naturalists were observers rather than collectors, and they pioneered a new relationship to the environment, one with the human touch, alert for the evidence of an Aboriginal occupation. With a kind of nostalgic curiosity characterised O'Donoghue's writing about the Aboriginal past at Hattah. In writing of his encounter with the birds, he reached for words to describe the wonder. The lake bed was comparatively dry, but in the remaining shallow water, at least 3,000 black duck, teal and widgeon were assembled, in company with innumerable black swans, pelicans, ibises, herons, man geese, grebes, cormorants and co. When this concourse of wildfowl was induced to take wind, the roar of their pinions and kaleidoscopic movements may be better imagined than described. O'Donoghue's 22-page account of his visit provides careful details of the flora encountered, all Latin names supplied, the impact of tree felling in areas surrounding the lakes, and long lists of birds. He married Western scientific understandings and classificatory systems with local and possibly Aboriginal knowledge of the area and habits of birds and animals, and a profound emotional and embodied response to this bird wonderland. It was the sheer abundance of birds, their numbers, the variety and the noise, which seems to have overwhelmed the ornithologists and field naturalists, who wrote in passionate defence of this place. They were also enamoured with the array of smaller, less charismatic creatures, the honeyeaters, cardelots, robins, tree martins, wood swallows, restless flycatchers. O'Donoghue mentions 120 species of birds in his account of their visit. The wonder of birds was not a new experience in settler Australia. In the Mallee in the early 20th century, however, the abundance of their presence and the awe and marvel they inspired is perhaps best understood as the closest the region came to the picturesque. Or maybe the aesthetic is Arcadian, a romantic ecology tradition, as Mulligan and Hill suggest in their book Ecological Pioneers. It's really striking how few early photos there are of the lakes. The promotion of them as a bird wonderland was a literary rather than a pictorial creation. Both Libby and Tom point to the significance of this. In Flight of the Emu, Libby notes that nature writing was an important way to bridge popular observation and scientific understanding. Tom observes the way nature writers took hold of the land emotionally and spiritually, and they could not help but deny, displace, and sometimes accommodate Aboriginal perceptions of place. Ornithology, Libby also notes, was seen as an improving discipline, and quotes Edmund Ashby in his 1927 Royal Australasian Ornithologists Union presidential address, such a mouthful that one, that ornithology made him an all-round man. Well, an all-round white man might be more precise. The men who travelled to Hattah Lakes and who wrote about their experiences shared a class and racial position. They shared an understanding of what type of man they were: educated, highly disciplined in their personal habits, willing to suffer significant physical deprivation in pursuit of knowledge. They believed in the importance of improving oneself and others. Through their interest in ornithology, they were men connected to the growing international networks of empire and trade, and of like-minded people who sought to protect native bird species from destruction. They were men with connections into government, the bureaucracy, universities. The version of masculinity they embodied was at odds with the increasingly dominant Anzac soldier, but like him, they were men who endorsed and benefited from colonial power structures and racial hierarchies. They were men with the time and resources to travel to remote areas, unencumbered by wives or children. Indeed, in this early period, they were all men. They were, moreover, men who distinguished themselves in every way from those who sought to kill birds, either for sport or food. As Emily O'Gorman notes at the Coorong, Hattah was a contested landscape, valued by many for different reasons. While Lewis gathered arguments in favour of the sanctuary, those who valued game, especially those who relied on it for their livelihoods, were given short shrift. An all-round man was not one who shot and sold birds for a living. The professional shooters, bird murderers, as Police Sergeant Carter called them, were an unmanly enemy. They did not play fair. They had a secret weapon, a carefully hidden punt gun, which the pro-sanctuary people knew about but could not find. This is not that punt gun, it's just an example of what it looks like. It lurked menacingly, making the lakes a precarious haven of refuge. One member of the field naturalists had heard reports of a punt gun killing 72 pairs of birds in one shot. Punt guns actually had been made illegal in Victoria in 1881, but their use was still continuing into the 20th century, and owners sometimes submerged them in water when they were not in use. O'Donoghue believed that the presence of duck shooters on the lake was responsible for the extreme shyness of the waterfowl, particularly the hoary-headed grebe. Acting Inspector Lewis surmised that the shooters frightened other birds away from the lakes. Both men understood that birds were adapting their behaviour in response to human threat. Just 5 months after the Odeon League of Progress wrote requesting Hattah Lake be made a sanctuary for game, it was approved, covering much of the lake's area. Lewis had clearly felt a sense of urgency about this declaration. He believed that the lakes were a haven for some species already facing extinction. Through their awe-inspiring display of beauty, sound, and flight, the birds secured themselves a modicum of protection. I think also that drought is really significant in the timing of this declaration of the sanctuary. People were really concerned about the water, the drying lakes, and the impact that that was going to have on bird numbers. It's a lovely example of climate and culture and their relationship, I think. One of the lake's greatest advocates was Les Chandler. Les was another of those yeasty individuals who helped transform the way people saw and thought about the lakes. He first visited the area in 1912 at the age of 24. He was already a passionate bird lover and member of the Bird Observers Club, the Field Naturalists, and the Royal Ornithologists Union. A jeweller by trade, Libby tells us, he designed a way to band birds without injuring them. He was also a passionate photographer and founded the Nature Photographers Club in Australia in 1919. Another group of interesting looking men. Chandler recalled that on this first visit in 1912, the Mallee country claimed him for all time. He served as a stretcher bearer during the war, and on his return, recovering from gas damage to his lung, he sought refuge at Kulkyne Station for 6 weeks. He would later write about this visit, including in his book Bush Charms. The book is very much in the tradition of Charles Barrett's nature writing. Barrett is one of Tom's subjects in Hunters and Collectors, a writer for whom nature writing was not just about nature, but the moral lessons that could be learnt out there. How appropriate that Barrett wrote the foreword to Chandler's Bush Charms, and just another example of finding yourself in a place where Tom and Libby have been before. Like O'Donoghue before him, Chandler found ample evidence of Aboriginal presence, the large tribes who haunted this locality. Chandler's view about the superiority of his own race changed over the years. In 1943, he observed, "We as a white race had much to boast about in our treatment of the blacks." He was highly critical of the wanton criminal destruction members of his own race inflicted on birds around the lakes. And he has this wonderful description of a bowerbird playing with a stinging nettle, hitting it on the ground, running to and fro. He is enchanted. "Happy, wonderful birds, when will unthinking man value your performance at its true worth? Is man so gross that he cannot place the fascinating beauty of such a display above the sordid materialism of life?" Through Chandler's writing and his photographs, he introduced readers to the lakes area and the enchantment he experienced there. He was articulating and creating a spiritual and emotional connection to a place most people would never get to experience. He endowed the preservation of Lake of Hattah with a moral commitment to both the non-human inhabitants of the lake and the generations of humans who deserve to be able to know and experience the magic of this wonderland. As Libby notes in Flight of the Emu, nature writing in this period sought to balance the personal and emotional with the scientific. Along with other nature writers, Chandler worked to put the voice and the feel of nature before the public. The trees. Chandler was almost as enamoured with the trees as he was with the birds. The lovely old gum trees, half hidden in the drifting veil of vapour, and yet glistening with moisture, were a fairyland of wonder in themselves. Standing on the bank of the creek with all that sublime array of artistic outline and colour reflected in the water at my feet, the whole merged into the white mist in the background, was to look upon a subject fit for an artist's dream. Chandler called a photograph of the old gums Nature's Cathedral, and it became an inspiration for him as he tried to capture in words the magic of this wonderland. In Bush Charms, he records, "A photograph of Nature's Cathedral is before me as I write, and in fancy I fill the great aisles with moving bird forms and hear the sweet anthem of combined sounds swelling through the trees." The trees, the birds and their chorus belong together in this sacred place. In Forest of Ash, Tom calls the mountain ash a tree of wonder. I think of river red gums as the riverine equivalent of the mountain ash. And it's telling that on the recent ABC program, Australia's favourite tree, the mountain ash won the judges' the favourite tree, but the river red gum was the people's choice. No competition, Tom. It's a tree of the heart. Presenter Paul West argued, "You'd be hard-pressed to find a more quintessentially Australian tree, with its gnarled yet beautiful form, embodying the rugged landscape that it calls home." The program identified Harold Casino as the artist whose depiction of a red gum, entitled Spirit of Endurance, helped create this strong settler identification with the tree. That's a somewhat truncated history. Casino drew inspiration from Hans Heissen, but as Matthew Koloff observes in his history of the river red gum, settler engagement with the aesthetics of the river red gum reached back well into the 19th century. Now, I've not time to explore that history here, except to say that in responding to and signalling out the red gums for their aesthetic, almost sacred appeal, Chandler was amongst the early artists to characterise individual trees as embodying their own monumental story of survival. Declaring Hattah Lakes a sanctuary for game may have protected the birds, but it did not protect the trees. The Inspector of Vermin pleaded with Lewis in 1915 to stop all timber getting around the lakes. Lake Hattah, he believed, could be one of the beauty spots of the Mallee. Chopping down red gum, etc., on the borders of the lake certainly does not enhance its beauty. Settlers generally seem to vie with each other in their haste to destroy timber of all kinds. The declaration of the Hattah Lakes as a state forest in 1924 protected it from settlement, but not from clearing nor grazing, both of which continued. By the end of World War II, nearly all the mature timber had gone. Chandler himself was busy clearing his own soldier settler block at Red Cliffs in the interwar years, and it was 1937 before he would visit the lakes again. One wonders if he drew any connection between the clearing he undertook in the Mallee and that of the declining bird life of which he was so acutely aware. His 1937 visit to Hattah prompted him to renew his campaign to make the lakes a national park. And in the following year, he published a heartfelt and poetic appeal for the whole area to be reserved as a national park. He described a chain of lakes with a beauty that would be difficult to surpass. In spring, the loveliness of the lakes, hedged in as they are by magnificent red gum trees, is enhanced by the sloping sandhills, emerald green with grass and gay with wildflowers. The red gums were central to his desire to evoke the sacredness of this place. Along the riverbeds, they formed nature's cathedrals and possessed an unearthly beauty. Fantastic in their form and beautiful in their soft colours, the red gums are noble trees. Herons, spoonbills, sea eagles, ducks, parrots, and a multitude of smaller birds nest in these trees. The most notable is the sea eagle that frequently nests and lives in these inland swamps. Chandler's campaign for Hattah Lakes introduced him to Jack Jones, a Melbourne-based trade unionist, public servant and printer, and another yeasty individual. Jones had joined the Ornithologists' Union in 1934 at the age of 23. The two men seem to have met appropriately at Hattah Lakes in 1939 on Jones's first trip to the area. Jones also became enchanted by the Hattah magic. He sighted a regent parrot and thought it one of the most beautiful birds in the world. His advocacy of the lakes had begun, and in his capacity as Assistant General Secretary of the Ornithologists' Union, he wrote to the Minister of Lands requesting that the whole Kulkyne area be protected from settlement through the declaration of it as a state forest. Mallee flora and fauna, he argued, were in urgent need of protection because of the extensive destruction of the Mallee scrub and its unique flora and fauna, in particular the Mallee fowl, a unique species with a precarious numerical status in Victoria at present, and still, I might say. Chandler and Jones had their first significant win in November 1940, when the Minister for Forests and Lands declared the whole Kulkyne area a national forest and sanctuary for flora and fauna. This proclamation did not go uncontested. 58 citizens of Mildura and surrounds gathered at the Working Men's Club to protest that the decision was high-handed, made without consultation by city-based bureaucrats, and against the sustained campaign of the local Mildura Trust Association, which had been successful in attracting many sportsmen to this district. Others, including the local state member on behalf of the council, pressed the minister to reduce the boundaries of the sanctuary, but the minister held firm. It's striking how long it took for an interest in water to seep into the consciousness of those passionately advocating the birds and trees of the Hattah-Kulkyne area. The initial request from the Oyen League of Progress had described Hattah Lake as a fine sheet of water, and there had been ongoing arguments about whether it should be impounded for use, especially by Mildura residents and for irrigation purposes. The idea of all the water in the lakes being wasted was powerfully and repeatedly advanced by different interest groups, but the location of the lakes and the scale of works needed to impound and transport it proved overwhelming. Jack Jones was the first white man to pay close attention to the water of the lakes and the shifting flows from the Murray River. Over 2 decades, he charted the timing and levels of inflows into the lakes. In 1959, the Victoria National Parks Association formally requested the Government of Victoria to declare all of the Kulkyne Forest a national park. The arguments advanced drew heavily on Jones's research. The area's relationship to the Murray River features prominently, evoking ideas about a quintessentially Australian inland river scene. The Kulkyne had a 33-mile frontage to the river where it flows as a broad stream fringed with old man red gums, typical of the personal impression and expectation of Australia's greatest river. The river was also the lifeblood of the lakes. Fresh water has great effect and appeal in a dry land. At high river, it spills over into Chalk Creek, which channels lakes and swamps, and over the lower floodplains, and at high flood over all floodplain. Life is refreshed and more is created. Tom notes in Forest of Ash that every nature park is a museum of human perceptions. It's such an elegant summation of the way ideas about the lakes coalesced in the campaign to have it declared a national park. The promotion of an Australian aesthetic drove the conservationist ethic. There were landscapes of flora and beauty, variety and novelty, to bring tourists to the park. There were kangaroos and birds of all varieties. There was the mallee fowl, which needed protection, and there was evidence of antiquity. Canoe trees, remnants of skeletons, and the whole area stirred the imagination of a tribal life gone forever. Alongside these evocative appeals to an idea of Australia and its deep time past sits the idea about water flows, natural cycles of flood and drought, and the floodplain ecology. Libby's 3 stages of changing views of birds and environmental management in Australia help us understand this. Initial advocacy is based on the protection of birds, then a shift to the focus on national parks and advocacy based on scientifically qualified experts, followed by the age of biodiversity. Jack Jones' charts and maps and descriptions introduced a new way of knowing the lakes. Now they were a system rather than a chain, let alone a pearl necklace. Jones served as a bridge between these different ways of knowing. He knew the thrall of the lakes and the magic of bird discovery, but he also knew the growing pressure to document and defend. Literary evocations of a bird wonderland would no longer be sufficient to protect it. Since the declaration of Hattah Lakes as a national park in 1960, water and the contested values surrounding it have come to dominate its history. The increasing regulation of the Murray River and the extraction of water for irrigation, industry, and urban use had a profound effect on the lake system. The presence or absence of birds is now understood as a reflection of the health of the lakes. Stressed red gums, a marker of how much environmental water needs to be released by the massive infrastructure that now controls the new hydrological regime. Now, photographers rather than nature artists are the ones to endow particular places with emotion and spiritual meaning. But those stories are for another day. In February this year, Sir Jackson Leslie Head, Ruth Morgan and I visited Hattah Lakes, still mostly unaware of the campaigns that ensured that this wonderland of birds, trees and water would be preserved. But in my own photographic record, it was the magic of the trees and the water that I self-consciously sought to capture. Without the emotions, dreams, senses and hopes that fueled the passionate locals, ornithologists and bureaucrats, the Hattah-Kulkyne area would never have been protected. The story of saving Hattah Lakes has all the ingredients Tom suggests constitutes Australian history: ecological crisis and management, environmental damage and cultural loss, and a heartening parable of hope and learning. Thank goodness for these individuals, Les Chandler, Jack Jones, and of course Libby and Tom, and the magical transformative power of birds, the trees, and the water. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we have ample time for questions as we ponder yeasty individuals and birds and trees and water. And I just wanted to also note just another little tribute to Libby and Tom, of course, the number of former students and people who have attended multiple environmental history workshops and other gatherings that you guys have been a part of. I think that's a wonderful tribute to the work you guys have done. Questions for Katie, online and in person?
I haven't disappeared completely. So I can
just in reference to, you talk a lot about kind of evolution of the way that we talk about nature and bringing in science and this kind of big breakdown of biodiversity. Where do you think it's going to go next? Nature writing and environmental history. It's a big question.
I was going to say just a small question there. Did everyone hear that question? Yes. So the question is, given what I've just sketched out about, showing shifts from nature writing to kind of a focus on biodiversity, where is it going to go next, and where is environmental history going to go next? Environmental history is becoming one of the most rich and engaging, well, it sounds rather biased here, but engaging fields of history, I think, and growing so significantly in Australia and internationally. And obviously that's got a lot to do with the environmental crises that we find ourselves in. I think one of the real trends that's happening now is to think much more thoughtfully and carefully about the agency of the birds, the trees and the water and all the other flora and fauna that are part of the environmental story. That's a really critical development. And I think the ways in which we understand that northern human world, and Emily O'Gorman and Andrew Gaynor have written really thoughtfully about this, for those of you who like to follow up that work. So I think that's one area in which it's really developing. I think that the relationship between the local and the bigger story, the international story, is a really interesting one that I think we're still working our way through. And it's particularly interesting in Australia to think about that and where we sit in the international field. I think that coming back to the question about biodiversity, if you like, and that language of science, I suppose one of the things that Libby and Tom have done so well, and that many of us in the humanities are still struggling with, is how to bring that humanities perspective and issues of values and justice into the whole discussion of climate change, the Anthropocene, biodiversity loss, etc. And I think that's something where the contribution that we have to make is critically important. It's critically important to understand that human-nature relationship, its history, and the way it manifests in so many ways, because we simply can't understand the current crises and unless we understand that relationship more fully. And so I think that's a really important role that environmental history has to play. And so it's a combination of both doing that research and also doing the advocacy to make sure that that voice and that perspective is being taken seriously. That's a really big challenge because the winds are against us there, internationally as well as more locally. But I think it's something that the possibility that environmental history has to engage deeply with the natural sciences, to build those bridges, to engage in those conversations is really critical as a future direction. That's just some thoughts up the top. Yeah.
Sorry, other questions. I think one, thank you for the lecture and the
Thank you. Yeah, it's Jamie.
Jamie at School of ANU. Katie, thank you for a fantastic lecture and one of great tributes to Libby and Tom, and very thought-provoking one. I'd be interested to talk to you and Hattah team later about Hattah's role now as a focus of the debate about the future of managing our river system with the changing climate. You know my watery obsession. I see Hattah as the epicenter of the debate between two fields of thought on the way forward. One championed by engineers in the Victorian government of increasingly engineering the Hattah Lake system and all of that floodplain to make it even more human dominated, to regulate less water, to sustain better coastal lakes. And the sort of view I hold, which is the more, I think, ecocentric one of trying to restore more of the natural flow processes. And I think there's a third one that's emerging too. That's how does modern Australia support an Indigenous reclaiming of water and these river systems? And that's playing out in coming months in Hattah with various environmental improvement processes that may or may not have mentioned this.
That's a really good question, Jamie. For those of you who didn't hear it online, Jamie is a water expert, I should say, and knows quite a lot more than I do, I would imagine, about Hattah Lake's current situation, and he's asking really about where Hattah sits in the tension between the increasing engineering management of it, the push to bring in some more natural flows away from the engineering, and then also the third area of recognising the Indigenous past there and honouring that culture and claims there in terms of country and land rights. Another small question. So the slide I showed of just the management works, if I can just pull it up again. That one. I could have shown lots of slides that give you exactly an example of what Jane is talking about in terms of the extraordinary engineering work that has been done at Hattah since it was declared an icon site and part of the Living Murray program. And it's the whole management of the Murray, of these icon sites, of the challenge of what people call modern water, and the way in which modern water seeks to divide water up into all different types of water. So you have environmental water, and you have wastewater, and you have overflows, and you have any other versions of water, which are all ways of fracturing it and disengaging it, delinking it from the land across which it flows, from the water as actually a river system, a waterway, as I was talking about with Kirsten Rainer this morning, about riverhood and all the relationships that are central to understanding the nature of a river as a living entity. And so that push for increasing environmental, increasing engineering and management is really powerful. And there's critical tension there, because on the one hand, the argument is that without that engineering intervention, Hattah would die. I mean, the lakes would die because there wouldn't be enough water being directed towards it for it to be sustained, because so much water is being extracted further upstream. Where's it going to go, Jamie? If that's what you're asking me. I'm a historian. So I look at the past and not the future. And I mean, I hope that part of the work that this water cultures project is actually doing is a really important one of recognising the riverhood of the river, of recognising those human nature relationships that are so central to understanding the river as more than a pipeline, more than a stream that gets water from one place to another for purposes of irrigation. Obviously, irrigation is important, and anybody who knows anything about the Murray-Darling Basin will tell you how central it is as a food bowl for Australia and all those things. But there continues to be a really interesting tension about the nature of water, how it's managed and what it means. And those tensions aren't going away anytime soon. And in a sense, the recent floods and the amazing volumes of water have in a sense just suppressed some of that intensity of that discussion for a little while, I think, until the next round. I'd be interested in talking with you about your thoughts though too.
We have a question online and then we'll return to the group.
Another small question from Julie McIntyre. My question, given your interest in gender in environmental history, how is gender as a frame informing the work you have presented here this evening? Sorry.
Thanks, Julie. So I gestured towards it, I think, here. And it's something that I really want to explore further. Karen and I are going to do some more work around this, focusing on another man that I didn't talk about today, who a guy called Charlie Thompson, who was actually the owner of Hattah-Kulkyne Station, and who was critical in introducing the people like Les Chanza, Lewis, etc., to Kulkyne, and was a passionate advocate of the area. So I think that the story I've been telling here is about white men, and I think the types of masculinity that these men were, I guess, relating to, influenced by, shapes their both their behaviour, their understanding of what they're doing, and their relationship with each other and with the environment in really critical ways that I'm not exactly sure about yet, to be honest. And what is so interesting in the written archive anyway is how few women are part of this discussion. And there are some obvious reasons why that is the case, as I tried to suggest. But I think that in this case, it's really the intersections too of gender and class, and gender and race that are critical to understanding those engagements. So it's an area I'm looking forward to doing a little bit more work on. But more broadly speaking, I do think that we really taking seriously gender as a critical focus of analysis in environmental history is another direction in which the discipline is moving. Ruth and I have done some work in this already, and Karen as well. And I think that's another really important thing to start to get our heads around the complexity of the human in the human nature engagement.
A couple of hands went up there before. Chantal? Yep.
Hi, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. I was really struck by the section about the cathedral and that he was clearing his land at the same time. And I guess it really got me thinking about books like Walden and just that whole, nature as, this cathedral, this oasis, this place we go to reconnect and rejuvenate and get a break from the material, the capitalist world. And I guess I was really thinking, like, with these kinds of pictures, that seems to me part of the tension that we haven't worked out how to be human in the landscape as white, settler societies. And I guess I felt a little bit excited in some ways, sort of thinking about the way that's breaking down a bit more with talks of biodiversity and corridors. And I mean, we're nowhere near getting there yet to something where we're actually integrated and working with the country we live on. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of schism, and seemed like an interesting area for exploration and a nice origin story of a bit of some of that tension is still around. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really lovely comment. For those of you online who would have missed it, it was drawing attention to the sort of schism in Chandler's own life between him, the way in which he cleared his soldier settler block, and yet on the other hand had this such reverence for the environment of Hattah, and particularly the red guns that he writes about. And the way in which that schism is evident in so many places. It's evident in the way in which the river is now managed, but also a more hopeful note I think you were drawing about, that hopefully some of that is coming together. You know, as Tom says, there's that kind of, there's the hope and learning, and then the environmental disaster and catastrophe, and it's all there. And that kind of in one sense continues to be the story, I think. And I don't know yet enough about Les to know whether he actually came to reflect more on his own role in kind of destroying an ecosystem of the Mallee. He certainly got very grumpy with his neighbours who would shoot birds in their orchards and things. But he, you know, the fact that he was a soldier settler is also really interesting, because he was therefore caught up in a whole scheme that was ultimately a bit of a disaster, although I gather that his own block was not so bad. Red Cliffs is an area that was being used for irrigation, so he wasn't on a dryland farming block, as I understand it. And they were a whole lot worse off in the Mallee than the irrigated areas. And whether he drew some distinction, I don't know, between the Mallee tree, as it were, the Mallee scrub, which was seemingly everywhere, and which, you know, as I described, was not loved by settlers at all. Whether he drew some distinction between that ecology and the ecology of the lakes. That's to me something I'm really interested in exploring, because I think that that kind of capacity to separate is exactly sort of what you're pointing to. I hope you're right that the greater interest in biodiversity and creating corridors, biodiversity, etc., bodes well for us, and for bringing together some of, you know, starting to knit together that schism a little bit more. It's good to be optimistic about these things.
Not wildly.
Well, hope and learning is very important, very important.
Oh, sorry, yes.
George Wilson, you described how in the earliest days the area was very important to the Indigenous community, and there were obviously many family groups there, and they would have been dependent on the wildlife there, the birds, the mammals, the reptiles. And then we go through a phase where the punt guns come in and it gets overexploited. The Indigenous people are moved away, taken away. And then we get into another phase where there's a total protection of the area. And so I'm sort of reflecting on what was the use of the wildlife of the area in those original days before the settlers came in. Is there much evidence or record of the extent to which the wildlife was used by the Indigenous community?
That's a good question, and I don't know yet enough about that that Indigenous past to be able to answer that with any great confidence and knowledge. We know that the lakes in the area were really extensively used, that the archaeological evidence tells us that. I mean, they are profoundly rich as both for food sources for fishing, you know, the birds and the flora. So there was food. Many of those species would have been totemic species as well. There was movement between the lakes and what was called the backcountry, seasonal movement of people who lived around the lakes. And they were one of the most densely populated areas. It was one of the most densely populated areas along the river from what the archaeological evidence shows. So I'm not sure whether the use of the fauna would have been any different from that in other areas where, so for foodstuff, for for, you know, potentially for tools, for clothing, etc. I just don't know enough about it to be able to answer that with confidence.
Yes, Ruby.
Okay, thank you very much. I was really interested in the gender aspect as well, especially the idea that, you know, animal and would it shoot a bird? But on a related note, I was wondering whether the debate between that older school of thought in conservation is animal ornithology, that it was okay to kill birds as, you know, specimen collecting, that you could admire a bird but also kill it, versus the later school of thought that wasn't acceptable. Did that play into this period that we
So I should refer to Libby here because she's the expert on this, but according to Flight of the Eagle, which it's the page. So the question is actually coming back to the issue of gender and whether the earlier 19th century practice of killing birds in order to study them and to know them by ornithologists, whether that was still being practiced in the early 20th century in this period. And the answer is no, basically, that activity had ceased by this stage. There had been quite a bit of discussion and debate about it, and some unfortunate incidents that Libby talks about in Flight of the Emu. But so by this stage, I'm fairly confident that the ornithologists and field naturalists who visited were not killing the birds. They were counting them and identifying them, and that was their passion, rather than killing them to then examine them. So that way in which they knew and understood had changed quite significantly. And so it was no longer manly to do that. Yeah, although that quote from Ashby, if I'm right, Libby, actually he goes on to talk about how that practice of killing birds had been something that he thought had been a good thing for, you know, young boys growing up to be able to do. So the older school was still kind of sometimes expressing those views with embarrassment to the newer knowledge, I think, to the new men.
Hello. I've got a question picking up on the manliness and the you mentioned Jack Jones was a trade unionist and that the opposition to the national park was expressed at the Working Men's Club or League, and I just wondered if there was an interaction between them and whether he was sort of a public advocate or whether it was more of a, you know, so if you've got evidence, I suppose, of conversations that were going on.
I don't know that there's much evidence of him conversing with the Les Chandler would have been much more likely, actually, because Les was local, to be conversing with the Mildura opponents, and Les was really active in writing for the Sunraysia Daily regularly, advocating for the lakes and refuting arguments that were put forward, etc. So he was very active locally. Jack Jones did a lot more work from Melbourne, which is where he lived, working with the bureaucrats, working with the different conservation organisations to really push the agenda. And the fact of him being a trade unionist is something I'm really interested in exploring a bit more. That's work that Karen and I are going to go on to do, because I'm not sure at that stage, I'm not sure how long. I think that came from his work as a printer, and I'm not sure how much influence it had on him, but maybe it was significant in terms of, one, giving him organisational capacity, and also links into different areas. And he was also a public servant, so he had really good links into the bureaucracy. And that was really critical in the 1940 declaration of the area being a state forest. When the Hattah area became a national park, there was quite a bit of tension initially that had to get worked through before, for example, the Victoria National Parks Authority or Association would take on Hattah as a campaign. And in John Birch's book, Returning to Kulkyne, he writes about those tensions and that time quite, in some detail, and suggests that in fact it was the campaign to save the Little Desert that Hattah was a bit of a precursor, and once the campaign to save the Little Desert had been successful, then the next campaign to make the whole Hattah-Kulkyne area a national park was basically much easier. So that campaign was really critical in shifting ideas about conservation, shifting ideas about all the government's role in creating, the land councils, etc., and conservation councils.
Right, well, I think we should thank, oh, I have one more question.
So just about the lakes, I don't really know that area. You mentioned there are a lot of lakes that dry out. Is that a natural process, or is it because of the Murray River water redirections?
No. The drying out of the lakes, the flooding and drying out is natural. So that was happening every 2 to 3 years before any regulation of the river. And then, a major flood would come probably every 8 years or 9 years or so. So that's the natural cycle. And one of the things that and Karen knows more about this than I do, but when it became a national park in the 60s, of course, it was made a national park on the idea that this was a lovely, beautiful place to go for picnics and bird watching and water activities. And when the lakes dried out, there was no water in them, then it wasn't quite so picturesque. So there were all sorts of tensions that the national park then had to navigate in terms of, actually, this was a national park that naturally dried out, and what did you do then? How did you change people's understanding of what a national park was and what they might expect when they got to Hattah? So there's some really interesting tensions there that come out, but the flooding now is basically not natural. I mean, it became unnatural as soon as the Hume Dam was built and became functional in 1939, and the whole cycle of the Murray River changed from one which would be basically much drier and lower flows in summer to reversing that. So now we have the high flows in summer because that's when the irrigators need it, and lower flows in winter. So the natural cycle of the river is the other way around. So there are no longer, natural flows in that sense, but the Hattah will still flood as it floods, as it has flooded at the moment with the floods that everywhere has been subjected to, but much of the environmental water that goes to it is environmental water delivered there through infrastructure.
Excellent note to end on. Thank you so much, Katie Holmes. To Libby and Tom there, and just a fantastic lecture. You've set a high bar for lectures to follow. I'd also like to thank Rowan, Jess Irwin, and Tash Blusham for helping to organise this evening's lecture. As many of you know, our Rowan is taking up a new permanent role at Monash in 2023, and we will miss him dearly. Thank you, Rowan, for making your mark here. I look forward to us working together in the future. And on that note, let's go outside and get some fresh air and keep the conversation going. More yeasty lips.